What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou from the Duran, and I have with me Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran.com. And today we're going to be taking a look at the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Angela Merkel. Alexander, we had Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, traveling to Berlin. A little bit outside of Berlin is where he met the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And there was a lot of press about the meeting. It was a long meeting, a 3-hour meeting, and they touched upon some various topics, which I would like you to get into some more detail on each of the topics. There was no press conference afterwards, so this is what we get from the news wires, specifically what I saw from an article that you sent me from TASS News, which outlined the topics that they discussed. The first topic was Ukraine. They said they also discussed Syria. They discussed the Iran nuclear deal. And what I think is the most important one, and which we'll probably be focusing on the most, is the Nord Stream 2. So go into a little bit of detail on all those topics. I outlined 4 topics. Go into a little detail on all those topics, what you think they talked about, if you think there was any outcomes or any progress of any of these topics, and what you expect going forward between Russia and Germany in a various a plethora of different geopolitical and economic situations that are going on.
Right, I think the first thing to say about the summit is that it happened in Germany, and I think that is incredibly important, and it's something that people have not really caught on to, because after the crisis in Ukraine in 2014, Merkel basically said that she wasn't going to invite Putin to Germany. So they've had various meetings, they've had many meetings at various times, but apart from one G20 meeting, there have been no summits between Putin and Merkel in Germany. And it was Merkel who invited Putin to meet with her in Germany. So this is in effect the Germans moving towards Russia. They're gradually starting to resume a proper dialogue of the kind that they had before the Ukrainian crisis began, and which they then put on ice to some extent, never completely broke down, but now they've really reached out to the Russians, and they brought the Russians to Germany, to a place close to Berlin, and they had their summit there. Now, what did they discuss? Well, they discussed the full range of Russian-German relations, but the key point, the thing that was really important to the Germans, the things that they won, the thing that for Merkel was the issue she really wanted to sort out with Putin, was, as you absolutely rightly say, Nord Stream 2, this pipeline that the Russians are building, which will supply Russian gas directly to Germany from Russia, so that it won't have to pass through transit states, specifically through Ukraine. And this is for Merkel now becoming a very important issue, because the German business community, which supports traditionally the CDU party, which is Merkel's party, they are completely committed to this pipeline, but there are a host of enemies to this pipeline. There's the US, which is campaigning strongly against it. There's Ukraine. There's the US's various NATO allies, Poland, the Baltic states, Britain, and nonetheless, Merkel wants to press on with this pipeline because she knows there'd be a big crisis against her in Germany if it didn't happen. And she brought Putin along to make sure not only that the pipeline was built, but that Putin would give her political cover to enable it to happen. So because of the need to build this pipeline for Merkel, she had to talk to Putin about other issues that beset the relationship, about Ukraine, and to, I think, a certain extent about Syria. But, as you absolutely rightly say, it was to get the commitment, to solidify this commitment, to get this gas pipeline built, despite all the enormous resistance that is coming under.
So you think the other 3 topics, specifically Ukraine, Syria, and the Iran nuclear deal, were just political cover so she can proceed forward with the Nord Stream 2?
Yes, I think so, because I mean, I think perhaps I'm slightly overstating it, because obviously these are important issues for her and for Europe. I mean, Iran, which is where the issue with the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, which the United States has walked away from, both Germany and Russia are committed to preserving it. But it's important to say that relations with Iran is something that Merkel knows the Germans and the Russians already agree about. With Syria, they don't agree about it so much, but the Syrian war is winding down. Germany has never been as opposed to Russia's role in Syria as some other Western states have been. And from the German point of view, again, that is not such a contentious issue. There are certain points that they want to talk about over it, but it's not the key one. For Merkel, the two ones that really matter are Nord Stream 2 and Ukraine. And the reason she wanted to talk to Putin about Ukraine is because, as a result of Ukraine's role as a transit state, as a state across which Russian gas and oil traditionally have passed in order to reach Europe and Germany, the situation in Ukraine is vitally important to her. And it is also vitally important to her because, of course, the EU has imposed sanctions upon Russia because of the crisis in Ukraine. So she needed to talk to Putin about Ukraine in order to be comfortable and secure in pressing ahead with Nord Stream 2. So for me, I am sure that those were the two subjects that dominated the discussion, with Nord Stream 2 very much having the priority.
So I would take it from listening to your analysis that Nord Stream 2 is definitely a go. I mean, nothing's going to stop it from happening. No. But you mentioned that you have certain powers that are placing very tough resistance against Nord Stream 2. Can you touch upon those powers, that being the United States and the Baltic nations, as well as Poland, who are resisting it? And you did touch a little bit upon Ukraine as well, because there are some transit issues with the Nord Stream 2 taking some of the transit, how do you say, the transit, transit state away from Ukraine and being shifted up towards Germany.
Right, now, there are two sets of opponents to Nord Stream 2. One set is the European states, the various European states that we've been talking about. Britain is an important one, by the way. I mean, they've never liked it because they have this complex about Russia, which we can talk about on another occasion. But they're opposed to any kind of good relationship between Germany and Russia. And then there's the East European states, Poland and the Baltic states, and of course Ukraine itself, which are the most important. It is important, essential to understand that in Europe, when the Russians and the Germans agree on something, European opposition doesn't count. Germany and Russia are the two giants of Europe. So if Poland doesn't like it, or the Baltic states don't like it, or if Britain doesn't like it, that really doesn't matter, because anything that the Germans and the Russians agree about is going to happen. The United States is a different force entirely, because of course the United States is a superpower. It is Germany's most important ally. It is a country with which Germany has historically had very close relations, which however are becoming fractured. And the US wants to stop Nord Stream 2 for two reasons. Firstly, because it too doesn't want the Russians and the Germans getting too close. But secondly, because, and we've talked about this before, the US sees Europe as a customer for liquefied natural gas exports from the United States, and it sees Russia as a commercial rival. The Germans want to buy natural gas from Russia because it is cheaper. It is much cheaper than US gas. Now, what the US has been doing is been threatening to impose sanctions on German companies and other European companies that involve themselves in Nord Stream 2. So for Merkel, this is a very sensitive issue. And the US is using the various conflicts that Russia has with the West and in Eastern Europe, and most importantly the conflict with Ukraine, to try and justify its attack on Nord Stream 2, which is why Merkel needed to talk to Putin about Ukraine. And what she wanted from Putin were some sort of assurance that the Russians would continue to send some gas, perhaps not very much, across Ukraine until while after Nord Stream 2 is built. And Putin made certain commitments about that, perhaps not quite the 100% cast iron commitments that Merkel might have wanted, but probably a lot better than nothing.
Yeah, I think they both made statements, both Merkel and Putin, where they specifically noted that the decisions that they're making about Nord Stream are purely economic in basis, and they're nothing to do with politics. Obviously there is, and from what I'm gathering from your analysis, the U.S. is leveraging, though, the geopolitics in Ukraine in order to try and thwart off the finalization of Nord Stream. Will
That's
the U.S.
exactly right. That is exactly what the game is.
Do you think the U.S. number one can succeed in doing that? And number two, which is kind of interesting to me, is it even feasible for LNG from the United States to replace Nord Stream 2?
Well, I'm going to answer the second question first. I think the answer is absolutely straightforwardly no. I think it would be horrendously expensive for the Germans. There's been some debate about this, but calculations are that it will be at least US liquefied natural gas would be at least 20% more expensive than Russian pipeline gas. And the latest study I saw says actually it wouldn't be 20% more expensive, it would be more like 50% more expensive, which, bear in mind that Germany is a exporting economy. It exports its various manufactured goods. It would mean that German goods become more expensive because it would cost more to make them, because energy is such an important part of the mix in producing goods. So it would make the German economy less competitive, which I think is also an agenda that the US is to some extent following, especially now that it sees Germany as an economic and trading rival. So there is that issue. And that is why Germany wants Nord Stream 2. Let's be absolutely clear about this. In addition to the question of cost, the simple reality is that the infrastructure to absorb liquefied natural gas from the United States does not exist, and I think it would take at least a decade to build it. So, I mean, it's not really for the Germans an option at the moment, and I think people need to understand that and to be realistic about this. So the Germans don't want liquefied natural gas to replace Russian pipeline gas, and for the moment it isn't a realistic option anyway. So there is that big issue for the Germans. I think one must always remember, though, when we're talking about pipelines between Russia and Germany, there has to be always a geopolitical angle to this, because there is a famous quote about NATO that was made back in the 1940s, that NATO was set up with three purposes: to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. In other words, to keep the Russians out of Europe, to stop the Germans becoming too strong in Europe, and to keep the US involved in Europe. Now, from the US point of view, and from the point of view of many other European countries, the big geopolitical nightmare is of a situation where Germany becomes too close to Russia. The Germans and the Russians agree, actually, on many things. Under the previous German government, that of Gerhard Schröder, they became almost de facto allies. It seemed to be evolving in that direction. And for the US and for some of the NATO states, a situation where a kind of Russian-German axis starts to emerge, that for them is a geopolitical nightmare. And for the US, were that to happen, it would start to, I think, threaten their position, or they would feel that it threatened their position in Europe. So anything that can be done to prevent this relationship between Russia and Germany getting stronger is something that you are almost certain to see. And the campaign against Nord Stream 2 is part of it.
Why is it, this may be a simple question, but I want you to elaborate on it. Why is it a nightmare to have Russia getting so close to Germany? And even furthermore, why would, because I read a lot about various Baltic states that they're building LNG facilities, or they have some LNG facilities ready, and there's this big, talk that they'll be able to absorb the American liquefied gas. I don't know how true that is, but why are they so resistant to having cheap gas? I mean, in the end, their citizens are going to have cheaper gas. Why would they want more expensive gas? Why would they resist Nord Stream 2?
They don't want cheap, they don't want more expensive gas. The point is they don't want Russian gas, because the Baltic states have got themselves into this extraordinary position of being Russia's most passionate adversaries, even though they're tiny and Russia is right on their doorstep. So anything that happens that weakens the whole NATO EU structure that protects them from Russia, which would be something like Germany and Russia getting too close together, would for them be a nightmare. So they would rather pay more for their gas, they would rather have a more difficult economic situation, because that's what they've sorted themselves out with, because their logic dictates that they should improve their economic relationship with Russia, not try and break it. But anything that does that, for them, is a nightmare, because it means, once again, the likelihood at some point of Russia becoming the dominant influence in the Baltic region. Now, the thing to always understand is that Russia and Germany are the two most powerful countries in Europe. And whenever the Russians and the Germans, and this goes all the way back to the time of Napoleon, work together, they always win. I mean, it was the Russians and the Germans, not the British, who defeated Napoleon in 1812 to 15. It was Russia that gave Germany the critical support Germany needed to achieve reunification. And when Russia and Germany worked closely together, as they did, if you like, to some extent in the first few months of the Second World War, the Germans and the Russians sweep the board. When the Russians and the Germans are in conflict with each other, it is a disaster for Europe, because these are the two big giants. But given that they are the two big giants, you always see people very nervous about them coming together. And if you're the United States, which is very nervous about its position in Europe in general, or if you are Britain, which is even more nervous in some ways of Germany and Russia getting together, then, as I said, you do everything that you possibly can, to the extent that you can, to keep them apart. And that is the reality, the overriding reality of European politics. It is, in effect, what the whole Cold War has been about, and it is what the whole post-Cold War politics have been about also.
Now, to close out this segment, it seems to me that we're not looking only at Nord Stream 2 as far as Russia getting gas into Europe. We also have deals in the works to get it via Turkey. Do you think there's going to be opposition from Germany on that side of the equation? Do you think they're going to allow Russia to pipeline gas via Turkey as a transit point into southern Europe?
There's going to be huge resistance, because, of course, the other thing is that the Germans not only want Russian gas to come to Germany for their own industries, they also want to be the major distributor through Germany of Russian gas. So, of course, there are also tensions between the Germans and the Russians on the gas issue, as well as I say, mutual interest. So that is going to be a major issue, and one which we will see how it's going to work out, because I think the Russians will go ahead with their pipelines to Turkey, regardless of what the Germans want. But can I just say something about Russia and Germany? Because it's not just a question of gas. These are two very compatible economies. The Russians have Russia is a country abundant in natural resources. Germany is very strong in manufacturing and industry. And so, in a sense, these two countries economically are very compatible with each other. And if the synergies are ever fully established, which they could be, and perhaps one day they will be, they form, in some respects, a natural economic bloc. And that is, again, something which I think an awful lot of people are very nervous about, but which an awful lot of people in Germany are very conscious about. Now, can I just say something about Merkel herself? Because, of course, Merkel has always been, in a way, America's person in Germany. I mean, she has always been very suspicious of Russia. And it is known that she doesn't get on with Putin very much. I mean, at a personal level, there's not much liking between the two. What she has at the moment, though, is a situation where her own CDU party has now fallen to 28% in the latest opinion poll, a crisis that it has never seen before. Her coalition partner is now on 16.5%. The AfD, which favours the kind of policy that we have been talking about of rapprochement between Germany and Russia, they're now on 16%. They're about to overtake the SPD, Merkel's coalition partner. And of course, we've talked about this in other programmes. The German business community understands that there are these synergies between Germany and Russia. If you go to Russia, if you go to economic conferences there or trade fairs, the Germans are everywhere. And they are very frustrated and angry about the sanctions that have been imposed, which have restricted the trading connections between Germany and Russia. And they are lobbying hard to get them lifted. So Merkel has to take all that into account, because ultimately her political position in Germany is slipping. So that is why she was forced to call Putin to Germany to speak to him there. And if I can just go back to the kind of reassurances that Putin gave her, he said that there will continue to be gas transit across Ukraine if it is economically sensible. In other words, he didn't give her an unconditional agreement to send gas across Ukraine. Right. You have to analyze his words very carefully, because Putin, I think, senses that he has the advantage over Merkel in these negotiations. And that was, I think, an extremely interesting point. And you will notice, and you said it right at the beginning of your program, they had their press conference not after the talks, but before. I am sure that was what Merkel wanted, because she didn't want to have questions asked about that. And that was, for Merkel, a very sensitive issue, because she knows that it will put her in a very awkward position with the US. So we've had detailed, substantive talks. Merkel is determined to press ahead with Nord Stream 2 for the reasons we've said. She's willing to defy the US, even though, as I said, her sympathies ultimately are with the US because of feeling in Germany, and Putin senses that he now has the advantage.
Seems to me that it's self-preservation on Merkel's part.
Absolutely. She's in a much weaker position than she was even a year ago, and she knows it, and Putin knows it too, and he's cashing in. I mean, can I just make a further point? I mean, you know, all the headlines, all the pictures of Putin going to Vienna, attending the Austrian foreign minister's wedding, dancing with her. Exactly. Now he knows. Now the Austrians, by the way, are major backers of Nord Stream 2. They also have a right-wing pro-Russian government, and they got political links with the AfD. So this was, in a way, a very clear message to Merkel, not just from the Russians, but from the Austrians also, that, you know, we have these views, and, you know, this is the partnership that we are all aiming towards. And, you know, Merkel, you've got to understand that, and you've got to adjust your policies accordingly. So I think this is a very important negotiation that we've seen between Putin and Merkel. It may not have resulted in any open agreements, but I think that it has made very clear to Merkel what Putin expects of her, and I think Merkel understands that he is now in a position of advantage and that she has to forge ahead with this agreement for Nord Stream 2 if she is to preserve what positions she has left in Germany.
Real quick, before we wrap this up, how much, you mentioned that Merkel has a lot of domestic pressure to get this deal done with Russia. How much pressure do you think Trump is putting on her, which is moving her towards Russia? Obama's gone, who was, you know, one of her best pals on the geopolitical scene. Now you have Trump, who's obviously been more antagonistic towards Germany. So how much influence do you think Trump is exerting in his war of words against Germany with tariffs on the automobile industry and all this stuff that's pushing towards Putin and Russia?
I don't think that can be underestimated at all. I mean, as I said, Putin and Merkel, it's known, don't really like each other, but at least they have to work with each other, and they know how to. I mean, they've developed this relationship, which is a strange relationship in some ways, but they've learned to do business with each other. With Trump, it's completely different. He loathes her. He doesn't like Merkel at all. He's made that absolutely crystal clear. He said this repeatedly. He doesn't like the way the Germans have been conducting their trade policies with the US. He feels that the Germans have taken advantage of the US. And he said it, and he's made that totally clear. And he wants the Germans to buy liquefied natural gas from the United States. So he's piling on the pressure. And at the same time, there are lots of people in Germany who see this and who are uncomfortable and unhappy about this, not necessarily because they like Merkel very much, but because from their point of view, they see that the US and Trump are trying to put Germany back in a box. The one that I said, where Germany is the loyal ally of the US, it does what the US wants, it buys US gas, it loyally supports German policy. And many, many Germans are now becoming very disenchanted with that. I saw an opinion poll recently which showed that there is now very strong majority support in Germany for all US troops to leave Germany. And that is quite a new development in German politics.
That is huge. That is huge. Yeah. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of Duran. That was a fascinating, very informative discussion on the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Angela Merkel. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And visit the Duran shop, buy a shirt, help support us, help support this broadcast. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Until next time, take care.